Hi everyone. I'm here today with a review of Celeste Ng's 2014 debut novel, Everything I Never Told You. Celeste Ng, for those of you who don't know or who have forgotten, is probably better known for her later published 2017 novel, Little Fires Everywhere, which was recently adapted into a TV show. I didn't watch that show, but I did read the book and I didn't find it that special. It was frustrating that the most potentially interesting moral dilemmas of the book involving adoption and abortion and motherhood in general were pretty much answered for us by the author. I mean, the characters weren't exactly morally gray. There were clear moral heroes and moral villains, even though in real life these issues are far more complicated than Celeste Ng made them out to be. Add to that the fact that the book split its focus between, I think, 5 different children with personalities that never really jumped off the page for me, and I found it an okay but overall pretty lackluster book. Nevertheless, I'd heard that some people who didn't love that book, including Claire from Clara Reads Books, had a higher opinion of Everything I Never Told You, so I figured I'd give Celeste Ng a second chance and see what she had to offer here. And I was pleasantly surprised. Everything I Never Told You is the story of a Chinese-American family. So is the author's own family, for that matter, which I think really came through in the characters and the dilemmas of the story, feeling more personal and authentic to me than those in Little Fires Everywhere. The family in the story, also like Celeste Ng's, raised their children in Ohio in a town that had almost no other Asian residents, leading to dynamics that are explored in this book. One difference, however, I think, is that Celeste Ng's parents were both Chinese, I believe, while the parents in this book, James and Marilyn Lee, are Chinese and white, respectively. The story opens with an immediate problem, a pretty serious problem, and a bit of a mystery. The Lee family's daughter and middle child of 3, Lydia, is dead. This isn't a spoiler, it's revealed in the very first sentence of the book, but I will take this opportunity to mention that I'll avoid spoilers for the first half of this review as usual, and then get into a few at the end, at which point I'll give you a warning so you can cut it off if you want to read it yourself. The police suspect suicide, but the parents are skeptical. Why would this popular, successful girl have taken her own life with a promising college life and career ahead of her so soon? So they begin investigating for signs of foul play. Okay, but let me just pause here for a second and say that regardless of what you hear elsewhere, there are some elements of mystery at the beginning of this book. I mean, the atmosphere is there, but this book is not a mystery book or a crime investigation novel. It's a character study of family dynamics with a little bit of an underlying mystery in the background, but it's going to be pretty clear to readers what's happened by about a quarter of the way through the book. So don't get your hopes up for some wild twists and meandering murder investigation or anything like that. That's just not what this book is, nor does it try to be that. Everything I Never Told You suffers much less from the flaws I saw in Little Fires Everywhere. They're pretty much all still present to a minor extent, but in a way that didn't hurt my enjoyment of the story too much, and I did enjoy this story. For example, we're still following quite a few different characters, but here there are 2 characters that really receive the spotlight. There's the daughter, Lydia, who has died, whose past we're learning about, and her elder brother, Nath, who seems to be the only one who really knew Lydia on a personal level. And these 2 characters and the dynamics between them were the strongest characterization in the novel. On the other hand, there are still a lot of other important but peripheral characters, most prominently the Lee parents, James and Marilyn, who feel less developed, which is a bit of a bummer since they could have had really interesting stories, but instead begin to start sounding like broken records by the end of the book. This is too bad, since I found both of them interesting at the start, but for the amount of time they feature in the novel, and since we have access to some of their internal thoughts through the narration style, they really needed deeper development than what they received, especially in the second half of the novel. I think I'll hold off and say a bit more about that in a bit, because it would involve a few mild spoilers to be more explicit about this, but this is one of the main criticisms that reviewers expressed on Goodreads, and one that I agree with, although it didn't bother me quite as much as for everyone. Because for me, the story was always more about the Lee children. Like, the fact that the parents sometimes came across, actually a lot of the time came across as nagging, always saying the same thing over and over and over again, felt strangely appropriate since that's how parents often sound to their children. But also, I think that aspect would have worked better if the narration style centered more obviously on the children's point of view. I mean, make no mistake, they are the real center of this novel, but because of the way Celeste Ng narrates this story, the narrator is a sort of omniscient presence that attaches itself to certain characters' thoughts for a while, and then meanders to another character, often even within the same scene. I actually quite liked this style and thought Ng accomplished it skillfully within the scenes themselves, but it leads to a few complications like this one I just mentioned, where normally we could argue that the not super complex parents we're seeing are actually just the parents as seen by the children, But this is contradicted by the very fact that we're actually seeing the parents' internal thoughts at some points. Similarly, I found that sometimes this novel did lack subtlety in the way that Little Fires Everywhere did, but this time it wasn't in ways or with characters that were so essential to my understanding or enjoyment of the story that it really irked me to the extent that it did in Little Fires Everywhere. At the end of the day, this book was enjoyable to read. Quite average, about what we might expect from a book of its type. It's nothing too adventurous, but it's pretty well written, and it stood out to me for the way that it explores the experience of being an Asian American, an environment where being Asian American really makes you stand out. Sure, this exploration could have gone deeper, but it also at least isn't a book that really pretends to go deeper than it actually does. And that gets at one of the aspects that I find most challenging in reflecting about this book. This feels like a book that aspires to be literary fiction, but is also fairly content with not being that literary. I'm sorry, I don't really know how to articulate that, and maybe it sounds like I'm insulting the book, but that's not what I'm trying to do. What I mean, though, is if you think of a book like The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, which I read recently, or Swing Time by Zadie Smith, these books fit squarely within the genre of literary fiction. They explore a lot of themes with a lot of subtlety in ways that feel almost incidental at times, because it's not like there are these strikingly obvious themes or points or messages of the story that stand out. Everyone will read those books and find that pretty different things stand out to them, as I observed when watching reviews of The Dutch House recently. And they won't necessarily interpret the book as having a particular message the author meant to convey. The message, if any, will be some fusion of the writer's emphasis with the reader's own experiences. And this is somewhat true of Everything I Never Told You, except I think that if I asked 10 people after reading this book what was the point or main point of the story in their eyes, I'd get more similar answers than I would for The Dutch House. Now, maybe that alone isn't a strong enough explanation to draw the distinction between this more literary fiction and what we're seeing here. Everything I Never Told You also differs from these two novels in that, although it's not plot heavy, it has at least something of a plot. I don't always love this reductive distinction in literary discourse of plot-driven versus character-driven stories, but I'd say Everything I Never Told You falls more in the middle ground of the two than most literary fiction novels do. And there's nothing essentially wrong with this, but this novel could have also leaned further into the literary territory if Ng had wanted to. This is fundamentally a novel featuring what could be very rich characters with compelling stories and backstories who really could drive the story entirely on their own, and who often do drive it on their own. So something is a bit off for me when certain plot developments come up that feel almost natural, and yet a bit too coincidental, a bit too convenient for a fully character-driven novel. As one reviewer I enjoyed watching lately, Just Juan Reader, put it, there's a bit of a cheese factor that usually doesn't work in this kind of a novel, and it doesn't work too well here either. I just didn't find it quite as off-putting or disorienting as Juan, who really didn't like it, and I'm going to link his review in the description. Now that covers all I'm going to be able to say without getting into some spoilers, so I'll just wrap it up by saying that all in all, I did enjoy this book, and I think at the very least, like Little Fires Everywhere for what it's worth, it opens some good discussion topics. And at its best, we get to learn about some pretty emotionally complex children and how their Asian ethnicity, well-intentioned but sometimes clueless parents, and personal idiosyncrasies shape the people that they become. So spoilers beginning in 5 seconds. Let's get more specific about the plotting. When I say this book feels like it's driven by convenient or sometimes inconvenient plot circumstances, what do I mean in particular? For one thing, I was able to predict some circumstantial events before they happened simply because I knew these events would complicate the story. Like when James, the father of the family, goes into his office at work, and I just get this bad feeling that his grad student, Louisa, is going to be there, because boy, wouldn't that really stir things up and add some serious conflict. The whole affair with Louisa is something that, in my opinion, just really didn't add any value. It felt like an easy way of complicating things and raising the stakes for the family, which their daughter just died. That's pretty high stakes already. In fact, I think it might have worked a lot better for me if it didn't escalate so quickly, this thing with James and Louisa. Like, if there was some sort of tension throughout the book, but little ever came of it, that might have been more effective for me. I'm just not sure I'm buying it, though, that James's grad student came to his daughter's funeral so that she could start an affair with him immediately, and he never even thought twice about whether he should maybe wait for things to settle down, even just a few days before making a decision. Yeah, people make dumb decisions, but this feels maybe just a little too dumb. And another aspect of this book that contributed to a sense of plot and that I have mixed feelings about is the sense of mystery, almost a pseudo-thriller feel that we get at the start of the book. Did Lydia take her own life, or is there something much more sinister going on? Could bad boy Jack have led her down a path of self-destruction, or worse, had a direct hand in her killing? And all these questions will be answered in the first few chapters of the book, after which it'll be clear to the readers that yes, Lydia was really mentally struggling, but her parents were just too absorbed in their own conceptions of their daughter to see the real Lydia. So, I mean, it's not exactly spelled out from the very beginning, but we can be pretty sure that this must have been a suicide unless something really revealing turns up. Celeste Ng leaves that possibility there to keep us wondering, but given that nothing is actually going to turn up, this slim chance of something out there that's left hanging over our heads feels like a distraction from the real mystery of this book, which is, why did Lydia kill herself? What do the other characters know about her that we don't know, and her parents didn't know? Basically, what was it like to be living Lydia's life? As an aside, I realized that from the way the ending was written, you could probably either argue that yes, Lydia killed herself, or that no, it was an accident because she was trying to survive, to swim to the shore, even though she couldn't swim and she knew she couldn't swim. I'm not particularly interested myself in which of those is true, given that regardless of the intentions, she was clearly in a deeply troubled state of mind, metaphorically and literally struggling to stay afloat. So yeah, I guess maybe that metaphor was a little bit too strong here, and this book is about discovering why that was the case. So the real question then was, is the process of figuring that out really interesting? Does it give us something to think about? Well, yes. Sure, Lydia's story and the parallel story of her brother Nath aren't mind-blowingly unexpected or anything like that, but that's probably a good thing because it makes these two seem like real kids, as opposed to two designed characters placed here to serve a very specific purpose in the story or to convey a certain message. And in this book, Lydia's story and Nath's story kind of contrast one another in one of the less heavy-handed aspects, in my opinion. They're each seen as the counterweight that keeps the other in balance. Lydia receives enormous pressure from her mother to succeed in school and from her father to be popular, pressure that she has a hard time living up to. She'd be satisfied with just doing okay in school or having even a few friends. Her brother Nath gets this, because despite his occasional resentment of all the attention that Lydia gets, he basically is a high achiever in school. He's gotten accepted at Harvard, and his parents never seem to care or be impressed. It's just a matter of course for him, the expectation. And that's because his father basically sees him as a born loser, and his mother is not that interested in him because he's not a girl. I mean, his mother wants Lydia to achieve the dream of a woman in science or as a doctor that she herself was never able to achieve. So throughout the two characters' childhood, Nath kind of helps to absorb some of this extra pressure off of Lydia. It's just too much for her to handle alone. But the prospect of Nath going off to college is terrifying to Lydia. Like, how will she be able to bear the final year of high school without Nath there by her side to pull her along? And the relationship between these two characters was a believable sibling relationship. They really love each other, they really care about each other, and sometimes they get really mad at each other, or even just get so absorbed in their own worlds that they temporarily forget about one another, like when Nath goes off to visit Harvard for the weekend. Ultimately, even when they drift apart for a little while, they know that they have the shared bond of growing up in the same household and being the only ones who can appreciate what it's like growing up with their parents' frustrating expectations, or in Nath's case, lack of expectations. And I love that the dynamics or the disagreements between the two never really felt contrived or unbelievable. Well, okay, arguably there's one part right before Lydia's death where there's a bit of bad timing and miscommunication that felt a little bit less natural than the rest and more in service of the overall plot. But altogether, these two characters and the novel's centering of the story on them kept the story alive for me throughout. What about the parents, James and Marilyn? They had a lot of potential towards the beginning, at which point we learned about their backstories, and they seemed like potentially really interesting characters. But as the novel progressed, it became clear that we had learned everything there was to learn about them, and we lost that possibility of discovering another dimension to them. We stopped believing that there even was another dimension to them. Both of the parents basically see in Lydia an opportunity for her to achieve what they were never able to achieve during their childhood, and they almost kind of use her as a pawn to make up for their past losses in life. Unfortunately, instead of this coming across as a complex dynamic, we see James and Marilyn both become increasingly single-minded, focusing on one thing and one thing only for Lydia, to the point where we'll be rolling our eyes every time James asks Lydia yet again if she's found a prom date, or when Marilyn yet again gives Lydia a present that is going to be a book about women in science, which is what all the presents she gives to Lydia are. And for some reason seems to be the only way the author uses in the second half of the book to remind us how important it is to Marilyn that Lydia become a doctor. The way Lydia responds to this pressure, though, is relatable and interesting. She basically feels this pressure to fill her parents' expectations, or rather to make it seem like she's filling their expectations at all costs. For example, when Lydia sees that her mother's approval seems to be contingent on her interest in science and education and the like, she feigns this enthusiasm for learning in order to win that affection, despite having no inherent interest in these things, at least not yet, even finding her mother's expectations suffocating. And this dynamic really did make me think. Contrary to the common notion of the mentally troubled teenager who's driven to exasperation by cruel and demanding parents and constant conflict, Lydia's struggle with her parents rarely manifests in direct conflict. Instead, everything appears to be going fine on the surface, but this superficial normalcy masks a deeper struggle just beneath the surface, one that her oblivious parents completely fail to recognize. And then there's Hannah. I almost forgot about her, which frankly is exactly what Celeste Ng wanted us to do, just like Hannah's parents almost forgot about her. Hannah, who is the other lead child, so to speak, doesn't feature very prominently in this book, but I really like the ways in which she does, and I think it's one of Celeste Ng's most impressive accomplishments in this book. The story is clearly not about Hannah at all, despite the fact that she is just as human and just as interesting as her older brother and sister. So she kind of just peeks into the story on occasion with a chapter here and there as if to say, wait, don't forget about me, and I really appreciated that. I also just loved the way in which Hannah develops this habit of stealing things from her family just to try to get them to pay attention to her for a few minutes. I think I'm in the company of many other readers too when I say that this was just so heartwarming and heartbreaking. It feels like it was intended to be precisely that, but I just don't even mind. I just kind of thought, well done, Celeste Ng. There's plenty more I could discuss about this book, including many little aspects I really appreciated or found thought-provoking, and this could be a good choice for a book club discussion. Sure, this book can't really be compared with the literary greats, which understandably made some good reads in YouTube reviewers really just dislike this book as a whole, but the author's intentions were just not quite so front and center here, and ultimately I enjoyed this book for what it was. And that's all I've got for Everything I Never Told You. Have you read this, or Little Fires Everywhere? I'd certainly be curious what you thought, since I know some of you will have stronger opinions on this book, either positive or negative, than I did. And if you want to hear more reviews from me on literary fiction, mysteries, classics, nonfiction history, and probably a whole lot of other stuff too, don't forget to like and subscribe, and until next time, bye and happy reading.